Okay. Under your arm.
I'm fine with that.
How much time do they want us to give you?
Only 10 minutes.
Please.
Well, what they're trying to do, there's so many of us, and they're trying to save time for...
Go for it. Don't ask me again. Just do it. Okay.
Hey, how are you?
No.
It's
You
good
in?
seeing you here.
Take your time. Are you?
What's that? I'm wired up.
Good morning. Before turning over the panel to Amir, I wanted to remind all of you, following this, our last forum of the spring exercise, that we will have a reception as we have done with the prior forums. So you'll have an opportunity to talk with the speakers at greater length. It will be over in Taubman, over on the top floor of the Taubman building in Taubman A, B, and C. So immediately following, for the hour following the forum, we'll be over there with a reception with our speakers. Amir?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming by for this forum today. I know that it's distractingly sunny outside, as it has been all weekend, and you've been busy writing memos, but I'm glad that you could make it. We have this morning 4 speakers who are going to be speaking on the various and diverse issues of providing care and treatment for AIDS. We're joined first by Dr. Michael Sinclair, on my left, who is the Senior Vice President at the Kaiser Family Foundation, which is a philanthropic organization working in the United States, South Africa, and elsewhere. In South Africa, particularly engaged in AIDS education and prevention. We'll then be hearing from David Skondras, who is based in Boston and is the director and founder of a small NGO known as Search for a Cure, which has been instrumental in advocating for broader access to treatment in African countries, particularly Malawi. David was a city councilor in Boston for a number of years before moving into this line of work. Judy Bello, the Executive Vice President of the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers Association of America, or PhRMA for short, will be speaking on the industry perspective of furnishing AIDS care and treatment in poor countries. This is her last day on the job, and she will be joining the faculty at another small university, I think it's called Princeton, afterwards. And finally, we'll be hearing from Jeff Sachs, Director of the Center for International Development. Jeff has just returned on Friday from Abuja, Nigeria, where, as you know, the Leaders' Summit on AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria was shortly underway. And Jeff will be giving us an update of those events as well as other thoughts on care and treatment. Without any further ado, Michael.
Thank you, Amir. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to talk to you about South Africa, mainly because that's the country that I happen to know most about, but also because I think it's a pretty good case study for many developing countries. Also because it happens to be the epicenter of the global epidemic right now, has the greatest number of people living with HIV and the highest rate of infection among 15 to 20-year-olds of any country in the world at this point in time. I think one of the most fundamental issues for us to have foremost in our minds is the difference in scale of the epidemic in most African countries to most other parts of the world, particularly this country and European countries. If we take South Africa, for example, it has a population roughly of about 40 million. Currently, about 12% of those are already HIV positive, so about 5 million. At the current rate of infection, that is projected to increase to roughly 20% over the next 8 to 10 years. So roughly 8 to 10 million South Africans could be HIV positive. And what does this mean for a country and particularly for a health system? The South African health system is 80% a public healthcare system. In other words, 80% of South Africans depend on the government for their health care. In a normal year, in normal circumstances, without any kind of major epidemic or catastrophe, about 10% of that 80% would be expected to access the public health system. So this gives you roughly 3.5 million users of the public health system in a given year annually, pre-HIV. Add the burden of HIV/AIDS care, and the projected patient load increase is roughly 4 times. Already, patient load at most South African health facilities has increased between 40 to 50%. But the health budget, accounting for inflation, has remained pretty much the same. So, what is happening? Clearly, there is a major level of rationing of care happening for everybody, including HIV patients, but most particularly for HIV patients. The question, obviously, that is on everybody's lips is, why doesn't the government do the right thing? So let us, for a moment, put ourselves in President Mbeki's shoes, and regardless of his equivocation about the causal linkage between HIV and AIDS, and let's just think about, like heads of state, like a politician. In President Mbeki's case, in the case of many developing countries, South Africa is dealing with 300 years of development, skewed by colonialism and apartheid, leaving about 80% of the population in serious poverty and large parts of the country significantly under-resourced. His priority has to be lifting the majority of South Africans out of poverty. International investors, as we all know, expect fiscal conservatism. They expect constraints on public expenditure and on public debts. So President Mbeki is going to want to invest in areas where he thinks he can get a good return on his money, such as education, housing, electricity supply, clean water, job creation. Healthcare, sad to say, is generally seen as a net consumer of public resources. South Africa, however, already spends 7% of GDP on healthcare, and this is pretty high by international standards, and what's more, it constitutionally guarantees universal access of all its citizens, regardless of race or income, access to free healthcare in South Africa. In grappling with the HIV epidemic, I think all policymakers have to come to grips with 6 particular questions. Firstly, will the intervention affect the course of the epidemic? Is it going to make a difference? Is the intervention affordable? Does the intervention have sufficient political support? Is the intervention cost-effective? Does the intervention warrant public subsidy? Is the intervention equitable? And finally, is it sustainable? Let's consider it another way. In South Africa, the trajectory of the epidemic is still on a sharp incline. In time, as in with most epidemics, it will flatten off. But that doesn't necessarily mean anything other than that the rate of mortality and the rate of infection are beginning to balance each out, and so you have a more or less constant pool of infection. The challenge for any government has to be, how do you reduce the net inflow into that pool of infection? Where are the opportunities to do that? Well, Mr. President, here are some of the options. Firstly, we can provide nevirapine to pregnant HIV-positive women, and we know that the odds are this will reduce transmission to their newborns by about half, by about 50%. We can even assure mothers, and that's if we can assure that mothers don't breastfeed subsequent to the use of nevirapine, because that has the odds of reversing the benefits. And this means we have to provide milk formula to these mothers for about 6 months postpartum. Nevirapine is not free. It's a lot less expensive than most drugs, but it's not yet free. And Nestlé's is not offering any reductions on baby formula that I'm aware of. And early childhood malnutrition, Mr. President, is an increasing problem in our country. What do we do about all the other mothers? The other issue we need to bear in mind, Mr. President, is that without antiretroviral access, these mothers will likely die in 5, maybe 10 years' time. So we are already talking something of the order of 800,000 orphans. In 3 to 5 years, that number will be 1.2 million orphans. And so we have these 1.2 million orphans whom we've been able to keep AIDS-free up to, say, 12, 15 years of age, and then they become sexually active. What I have to remind you, Mr. President, is that we already have something of the order of 12 million teenagers in South Africa under the age of 15, about 40% of our population. And over the next 5 to 6 years, the majority of that 12 million are going to become sexually active. The other thing we need to bear in mind, Mr. President, is that about 75% of that 12 million live in households with less than the minimum level of income. So they're all seriously poor. What's driving the infection rate? Teenage girls having sex with older men, and teenage girls then having sex with boys in their own age cohort. We have spent an inordinate amount of money on HIV education, and these teenagers know about HIV/AIDS. They can tell you articulately, 98%, surveys show consistently, and yet condom usage remains at around 10%. there has been no change for our money. Then, of course, there is heart, the antiretroviral therapies, complex therapies requiring fairly intensive medical supervision. It looks as though we may be able to get these drugs at next to no cost pretty soon. Still, we have questions, Mr. President, about the sustainability of the supply. You, Mr. President, have questions about the toxicity, particularly of the untested generics. We even have the infrastructure relative to other African countries, Mr. President. If we're talking about basic clinics and basically trained health workers, our infrastructure is almost 100%. But handing out the drugs is the easy part. There are issues of compliance and monitoring. Lab work, for example, which is costed at an average of $100 per patient. How do we ensure that that is done effectively in the infrastructure that already exists? How do we ensure that patients comply with those sort of requirements? The drug needs to be taken with food at certain times of the day. How do we monitor that? And you, Mr. President, I'm sure are going to ask the fact that we have had a TB epidemic in our country for decades, and even with directly observed treatments and well-established therapies, we haven't been able to get a handle on that. How on earth are we going to manage these new antiretrovirals? And the president, as is Mbeki's wont, will probably rub his beard and pull out his pipe because he smokes a pipe, and he will say, how many people did you say might be on these drugs one day? And you will have to answer around about 10 million. And he will say, let's imagine they're vigorous and sexually active and still HIV positive. Then what? So the point is, Mr. President, the spectrum of interventions is becoming more effective and more affordable. We could reduce transmission to newborns. We could give a certain proportion of our population access to antiretrovirals. But the fact of the matter is, the most fundamental way in which to impact that trajectory, which has to be our goal, remains behavior change. Otherwise, even if we choose to invest in all of these other strategies, and even if we skew our national priorities to fully fund a 100%, the 100% range of interventions, all of these interventions could be naught. And Mr. President, effective behavior change, we know, depends on showing people a better way of life, and that is prospects for a way out of poverty. And so when we talk about prevention, we're not just talking about condoms. We're not just talking about sex. We're talking about the prospects that people have for living a better life. If they cannot internalize that level of benefit, the risk does not seem to be as great. So for a country like South Africa to determine its HIV/AIDS priority, it is absolutely fundamental to admit that resources are limited. Not all interventions for all people can be supported. And it is also absolutely essential that choices regarding HIV are made in the context of national priorities. It may seem callous and it may seem even immoral, but the political calculation is what is going to produce the biggest benefit for the greatest number of people. It's not just about the cost. It is mostly about the cost effectiveness. Thank you.
Thank you. David?
When this panel was originally thought of, the situation was dramatically different from the situation today. My original role was to talk about the issue of the struggle with international pharmaceutical firms and securing an adequate supply of inexpensive antiretrovirals. I think that the events of history actually, for once, are moving faster than policymakers' articulation of the problems. I think the reality is that there is, in fact, a two-tiered pricing system emerging very rapidly, that there will, in fact, be drugs at marginal cost of production made available to the world on an as-needed basis shortly, that there will be an international fund that will be fairly substantially contributed to by both Europe, Japan, and the United States, that the details are certainly important. God is in the details. But I would like, instead of talking about those details that I think Judy is going to get into, to try and jump ahead of the curve a little bit and refocus us on the original point of our intervention. We have a worldwide AIDS epidemic. The whole point of trying to get ARVs to the world was to find a mechanism to put an end to the epidemic. And let me be very specific about this. We've characterized a lot of our struggle to end this disease as treatment versus prevention. I'd like to articulate the notion that treatment is prevention, that they are not distinguishable for a variety of reasons. The ones that are more obvious are the fact that testing and asking people to participate in behavioral modification without any reward, without the prospect of being able to live a life with medicine is ineffective. It simply doesn't work. However, there's something more dramatic. In Uganda, not long ago, there was a study done by a doctor named Quinn that added some weight to what already had been suspected for many years in the scientific community. That study showed that in 419 serodiscordant couples, that means one person has HIV and one doesn't, over a 30-month period, that 90 seroconversions occurred. 90 people got HIV from their partner, but none if the viral load of the partner was below 1,500. Not only that, but that every log increase in viral load of the partner led to a 2.54 fold increase in transmission. In other words, dramatic proof that if you lower viral load, you stop people from transmitting. Let me make this very blunt. If you treat people with IRVs who are transmitting the disease, they don't transmit the disease. We have a vaccine that works, that's effective. There are a variety of other ways I could articulate to show this or demonstrate this. Perhaps one of the most dramatic ones is the fact that in 1997, the highest peak of genotypic condon mutations that are correlated with antiretroviral usage was noted around the world. What that means is this, that when we didn't have effective therapy that lowered viral load, you can see the virus that got passed on was resistant to the drugs that were used earlier. But guess what? That started going down in 1997, not coincidentally, with the use of combination cocktails powerful enough to reduce the virus low enough so that transmission doesn't occur. You just don't find a lot of multi-drug resistant virus for the simple reason that if people are using cocktails, they generally don't pass the virus on to anyone else. That's been going down since '97 every year and is continuing to go down. There are other examples, which is if you try to interfere with neonatal transmission in women, the way you do that is lowering viral load in the women. The point I'm trying to make is we need to come to a decision. What is the point and what is the shape of the programs that we're going to fund in countries? What is the shape? What are we going to push for? And let's not kid ourselves. It's not just the country that will determine that. Funders and the world community's thinking does in fact influence to a large extent what shapes programs take. There are two possibilities. One possibility is to try to intervene by protecting babies and people who are sick. I want to be very cold for a moment and point something out. Those are the two groups of people least likely to pass infection on to anyone else. And such programs will be least likely to, in any significant way, impact the epidemic. Ironically, if we wish to impact the epidemic, the shape of those programs becomes critical. And now's the time to begin discussing what types of programs do we need. The bottom line, if we do not use this window of opportunity to secure testing and treatment for people most likely to transmit in the context of transmission, then we will have missed a tremendous opportunity to dramatically reduce rates of transmission around the world. I think that that's the basic message that I'd like to talk about. I think there's a tremendous amount of other material that needs to be gone over. There's a spotlight that has been thrown on our patent laws, on issues around drug development. There are questions about exactly how much money the U.S. Congress is going to allocate to funds. There are things like that. But in the end, if we don't agree upon parameters for the programs, then we may have spent years of struggle to finance large-scale programs that ultimately do not affect in any way the actual epidemic. They make us feel better. And they perhaps save our soul for the afterlife and give us brownie points in terms of our feelings of ethics, but don't necessarily impact the epidemic. So because of that, in countries like Malawi and other local leaders who see this, there is an emphasis on looking at local trials to try and determine the best way to intervene meaningfully in transmission. Should we deal with serodiscordant couples? Should we make sure that in the case of serodiscordant couples that the partner is treated? Should we look at patterns of sexual behavior? Should we identify sex workers and in fact test and treat? Should we be looking at early seroconversion illness? Because we now know from studies at Mass General Hospital that if you can catch people prior to the formation of antibody but after infection, you can actually dramatically lower viral load throughout the person's lifetime and even do without drugs. What are the best ways to deliver these drugs in any event? Some of the ways which are cheapest still allow people to be infectious. Are we going to take the least expensive program that is the most compelling because it deals with the innocent and the sick, but doesn't affect the epidemic? Or are we going to design programs that may be initially more expensive, but ultimately give us the possibility of putting an end to the epidemic itself and saving the economy of the countries involved? I'll stop at this point and turn it over to my friend Judy.
Thanks very much. There's three messages I'd like to share with you today. The first one I won't belabor because I've seen the materials that you've read already, so I'm sure it's well covered. I also won't belabor it because when a representative of the pharmaceutical industry makes these points, they're often heard through a different filter. And the filter is often that this means that the industry is trying to discourage people from amassing and marshaling the resources to attack such a difficult problem, or that we're really simply trying to shift the blame and the spotlight away from pharmaceutical prices and patents. But at least in an academic community, we need to recognize the breadth and depth of the problem that we're facing in Africa and in other parts of the developing world. And it is about much more than drugs, their prices, and their patents. And a solution on any sustainable basis will require many more partners, governmental, NGOs, and others to help out for a real solution along with the pharmaceutical industry. Because the problem is about crushing poverty, too few doctors, other healthcare providers, clinics, or hospitals. The few that exist often exist in metropolitan areas, whereas the vast majority of the population often lives elsewhere. Too little energy and clean water. Too little political will in both developed and developing countries. Too few African leaders spoke up about AIDS during the 90s when the epidemic was skyrocketing. And during the same time period, developed countries slashed their aid to Africa by over 40% at exactly the wrong time. And of course, there's the most difficult of all, perhaps, problems of behavior and cultural mores and practices, which particularly adversely affect women and make AIDS in particular a challenge overwhelmingly involving women and increasingly young girls. I read, of course you can read about this issue in the media every day, but over the weekend I read that there's 95,000 kids under 15 who are infected in South Africa, and most of them are girls. Since there is a prevalent belief that raping a virgin is the best way to effect a cure of AIDS, and because women often don't have the socioeconomic or political status in the developing world that they do elsewhere. So drugs are a part of this, but they need to be seen in context. It is a vastly difficult problem, and we need to address all aspects of it in the appropriate sequence, perhaps, but it is a very large problem that the pharmaceutical industry alone cannot solve. However, we must be part of the solution, and I would offer, and I invite your comments, including your opposition if you have different views, I would suggest that we are being part of the solution in two crucial ways. One is that we are helping on the short-term basis in promoting access to treatments for HIV/AIDS, including the very costly antiretrovirals. The pharmaceutical industry has contributed over $1.2 billion to the developing world over the last 5 years. Now, you can argue that it's not enough, but that's a very significant contribution that the industry has made precisely over the time period that the developed world has reduced its aid. So the industry is helping in the short term, and of course the recent developments have shown a large number of the major pharmaceutical companies that individually have offered to give drugs away for free in some cases, to sell at marginal cost in other cases. Those are commercial matters that a trade association under our antitrust laws cannot be involved in, so I have not been a part of that. But the individual companies are making a big difference to provide access, and the patent litigation in South Africa has been settled on a basis, I stress, which includes the South African government's commitment to comply with the trade-related intellectual property agreement of the World Trade Organization. If you have questions about that, I'm happy to address it. But the principal contribution of the pharmaceutical industry always has been and always will be what the pharmaceutical industry has the comparative advantage to do, and that is innovation. HIV/AIDS was only identified as a disease, as you know, actually relatively recently. We have 64 medicines now, including the protease inhibitors, which used in combination treatments have been a miracle from my perspective, reducing the HIV/AIDS death rate here in the US by 47% in 1997 alone. That's the largest drop in a leading cause of death in American history. And over the last 5 years, it's contributed to reducing the US death rate by over 70%. But we don't have what most people would call a vaccine today. We don't have enough medicines, and the medicines don't work for everyone. In Canada and the US, studies show a 14% increase in drug-resistant strains of HIV among new patients. So we need innovation to continue. And the fact is that your head will tell you, even if your heart resists, that the rate of innovation in the private sector, which leads the way here, depends upon two public policies. One is the freedom for each individual company to price its own products, and the other is strong protection of intellectual property. So if we erode these policies, there could be a detrimental consequence that none of us would wish to pay. Now, in my view, there's always been multi-tiered pricing by individual companies. I'm often excoriated on Capitol Hill why prices are lower elsewhere than in the United States. Now, among developed countries, that's because most other developed countries impose price controls. But prices are also lower in many developing countries because people can afford to pay less. So if an individual company wants to have a market, it has to be willing to sell at prices that people who live there, or at least some significant part of them, can afford to sell. So while we look at the drug issues, including notably prices and patents, we need to recognize that if we reduce intellectual property protection, particularly in the developed world, which is who are represented in the legislatures and administrations of the developed country governments, people elected to represent Pennsylvania care just as much and more about the poor people in South Philly as they do of the poor people in Soweto. We need to be mindful that if we change these policies, we will affect consequences which will reduce the rate at which we innovate, and we need to think very, very hard about that. I always get the toughest questions on any panel I've ever participated on in the last 3 years, so I look forward to your questions. I do welcome different viewpoints. Public policy is very much a balancing act. And while we need to care very deeply about promoting short-term access to the medicines that people need that can save their lives and make their lives so much better, and they're very much needed in the parts of the world that are devastated by HIV/AIDS, we also need to look at the longer term, and that is we need vaccines, we need more AIDS treatments, we need more simplified AIDS treatments along the lines of the TB treatments that can be taken just once a day for 6 months for only $5 to $12 a month in the case of TB to be effective, and yet millions of people die every year of tuberculosis, diarrhea, malaria, because the problems, while they include prices and patents, are so much larger, and in particular include crushing poverty and political will in both the developed and the developing world. Thank you.
Well, that's 3 for 3 that I disagree with, so plenty to talk about. I think the starting point to really frame the issue is to appreciate how, for one reason or another, the world has been able to go with a straight face for 20 years doing nothing in this pandemic. That's the first thing that I would urge you to think about. We're in the middle of the worst infectious disease pandemic in hundreds of years, and we have this incredible capacity of serious people to do absolutely nothing. We heard a couple of very articulate statements about why you would do nothing, which I couldn't agree with less, but I thought they were very challenging, and maybe what Mr. Mbeki is hearing is that, I think we should ponder this. Of course, I hope that you realize that up to this point where this disease has started with some small number of infected individuals in the late 1970s and has reached 36 million infected individuals by current UN AIDS estimates right now. The actual effort to do something about this is measured by dollars spent, for example, or actual programs implemented, has been essentially zero. Because it takes even millions of dollars to have talk fests, you find small numbers of dollars have been spent for many years. Amir and I estimated that the average amount of spending for all of Africa by all of the rich countries ran at around $70 million a year in the second half of the 1990s. That you should think about as essentially zero. That's nothing to run anything. Far less than almost any programs at the Kennedy School or anything else. It is an amazing zero on the international scene. We're throwing away people just willfully right now. I disagreed with David Skandris when he said that treating people is just making us feel better, but it's not really doing anything. I don't understand this philosophy at all. I actually believe when you're sick, you go to the doctor and you try to get better. And I believe that treating people is, when they're sick, if you have the medicines to do it, is an important part of civilized life, which I think we should aspire to in our planet. There is not one person in the world, not one person in the entire world that is being treated as a result of an official development program by any rich country in any poor country. Not one single person is on antiretroviral therapy anywhere in the world because of anything the World Bank, USAID, Swedish CETA, Canadian CETA, British DFID, Swiss cooperation, or anyone else is doing. Not one individual in the entire world. Has anyone here had a computer virus in the last few years? Anybody?
Sure.
Can you raise your hands if you did? Now, I assume that you all threw away your computers when you got that virus, right? You just said, well, computer's useless, let's throw it away. I had a virus on my computer a couple of weeks ago, and it was really frustrating. It just stopped all work. And if there wasn't a computer doctor down the block who came in an hour and fixed it, I really would have heaved it out the second floor window out of frustration. That's what we're doing right now when people get a virus. They can be treated for a few $100s per year of drugs. We're throwing them out the window. We're saying you're on your way to an early grave. And yes, too bad about the 12 million orphans that have already been left behind and the 40 million orphans that are projected to be with us in the year 2010 under the current scenario where we condemn parents to death because we think Africans are not worth $500 a year in drugs right now. So I don't view the issue of treating people as an incidental issue, or if we don't stop the infection, somehow treating people as salving my conscience, but it's not doing anything. It's keeping people alive, which actually in economics has good value. We generally assume when it's real people in rich countries, and I'm obviously speaking facetiously here, I don't want to be misunderstood, but when it's real people in rich countries, we should spend maybe 3 times average per capita income to extend their life by 1 year. When it's poor people, we just think we should throw them out if they happen to get the virus, because what's the difference? And that's the situation that we have been operating in. Understand that African countries are so poor, they can do nothing on their own. That's tragic, but that's the truth. The average income of Sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa for a moment, so take all of Sub-Saharan Africa other than South Africa, the average income is about $310 per capita. If you mobilize 4% of GNP for health, which is more than almost any country can do, especially since they're bankrupt, being forced to pay several percent per year of GNP in debt service, even if you got 4% of GNP, you'd be at $12 per capita. And if you made a miraculous 5% of GNP, you'd be at $15 per capita. And you have millions of people in your country dying of AIDS, TB, malaria, not to mention vaccine-preventable diseases, diarrheal diseases, respiratory infection, and the like. There's no way that the impoverished countries can do it on their own. So if there's to be a chance, the only chance is that actually we in the rich countries decide that we shouldn't just throw out people on the basis that they have a virus, but actually provide some financing to make it possible to do something. Now, is it cost effective, as Michael Sinclair asked? I think he was arguing as devil's advocate for Mr. Mbeki, whose position on this I find so completely mind-boggling I can't even start. Because the answer is South Africa can't afford it on its own, but Mr. Mbeki should simply say so and tell the world how urgent it is that the world help South Africa to treat people, rather than doing every possible obfuscation to not talk about this issue. It just takes asking, and maybe we'd start to get somewhere, but instead we have incredible runarounds that I do not understand. So is it cost effective? Is it cost effective to throw out your computer when you get a computer virus? No, probably not. Is it cost effective to throw out mothers and fathers and teachers and doctors and peasant farmers and others when they get a virus? Probably not. The thing to think about is the incredible ramifications of living in a world where every time you get a virus, you die, as opposed to being treated at a small fraction of a few $100s per capita. You lose the annual labor income just as a start. So don't forget that during this 10 years where people are dying on average from the infection and they're repeatedly sick rather than being properly treated, they've lost all of those labor earnings, not to mention the fact that their early death leaves their families destitute because they no longer have the income that the wage earner was taking. You have the incredible costs of hospitalization from the opportunistic infections that Brazil's interventions show can be substantially cut if you actually treat people seriously rather than treating them like subhuman specimens by not offering treatment. You get massive demoralization of society where you have 20% of the adults dying and nothing's being done. Do you think that's a normal kind of place to live? That you're going to not have massive crime, massive breakdown of public order, massive loss of legitimacy of every institution when you have dying societies and no one's lifting a finger to do anything about it? You have millions of orphans being created. They cost a lot of money unless orphans are to be thrown out also. And so where are these calculations about cost effectiveness that ask what happens to the orphans? We have 12 million now, as I mentioned, going up to 40 million by current epidemiological estimates. Let's add that to the cost effectiveness. Think about your position going as a foreign investor into South Africa now and knowing that the average labor force that you hire is 20% HIV. You think you're going to go there as opposed to someplace else? No. You're damning the economy. Mr. Mbek's great hope, you're absolutely condemning the economy to economic failure. Who the heck would go invest in South Africa right now when there's no strategy, no treatment, and you have a large proportion of the labor force, surely, that you'd hire being HIV positive, and therefore adding massive complications for yourself in your future labor policies, in your training strategies, in your replacement strategies, in your social policies in the firm, in the fact that you can't build up what's called organizational capital because your key workers will keep dying. So what kind of economic cost effectiveness is that? And then think about behavior change. We all probably sit around assuming that people that have AIDS or are HIV infected know what they're doing and are making various calculations about how to handle their condition. Well, the fact is that probably 95% of those HIV infected in Africa don't have any idea that they're HIV infected. The amount of actual testing is minuscule. The interpretation of the disease is not as you think in most parts of Africa. Most people do not know or believe or care whether it's transmitted by sex through a virus. A very frequent interpretation, even in an urban setting like Soweto, is that people are being poisoned, they're being subject to witchcraft, they're being subject to curses within families. It's hard maybe to imagine this, but this is what those who are deeply involved in these communities will tell you. The interpretation that this is a virus that can be stopped by the kind of teaching and education programs that we favor is silly when, in fact, communities are living completely outside of the medical system or the, quote, Western scientific system. When I was at the AIDS conference last week, what was being passed around was faith healing manuals, literally, with pictures of the prayer services that were healing the AIDS victims and victims of other diseases. Because this is a disease that hasn't been connected to Judith's industry. It hasn't had any interface with real drugs. It's not seen that way. How many of the 25 million HIV-infected Africans actually have ever seen an antiretroviral drug? The answer is estimated to be about 10,000 out of the 25 million. So how are you going to get a prevention program working? You think this is interpreted like we would sit around at the Kennedy School thinking about the perfectly rational responses? You think people go in for their testing in this context when there's no treatment, when there's nothing but stigmatization, but of a kind that's more complex than I realize? It's not just stigma that you have a disease, it's stigma that you've been cursed. Someone's obviously cursed you in many of the contexts in which this disease is interpreted right now. So we have willfully taken the disease out of its medical context. We don't treat it as a treatable disease. We don't approach it that way. And 20 years of, albeit meagerly funded, education efforts have done nothing to stop this. And we could be here in 10 years with more prevention efforts, and we'll have the 75 million or so that are HIV infected around the world, and nothing will have been done, and we'll wring our hands. Why wasn't prevention more effective? So to me, it's ridiculous to say that this isn't cost effective. If those are what Mbek's aides are telling them or what the president believes, it is one of the most shocking misunderstandings of modern times. But the worst shock comes from the rich countries, because we've stood by when the Black Death has raged. But unlike in 1348, there's actually a treatment that works, but it doesn't matter. the Black Death rages anyway, and we sit here pontificating about whether people are worth treating or not. That's the real situation that we're in right now. Now, we've got to start, and the Harvard consensus statement, I think, shows that at a technical level, it's feasible to begin scaling up. They have the statement, I assume,
yes,
in the readings, yeah. And I think that this is the urgent need. And I think actually we've arrived at such a horrendous state in this world between the real facts on the ground and what we've done about them, which is absolutely nothing, that from every standard, whether it's the moral and humanitarian standards or the economic cost effectiveness standards or the national security standards, we're actually going to start doing something, because the gap between where we are and where we need to be has widened to the most horrific gap of any policy issue in the world. Thanks.
Thanks to all the panelists for that. We are probably going to wrap this panel up early unless all of you have a number of questions, which I hope you do. So I'm going to open the floor now for questions. I'm going to ask at some point, I think it should emerge naturally for the questions, for Judy and for David to perhaps comment on one another's presentations. And I think Jeff has placed himself as an open target for sure. So please go to a microphone and ask your question from there.
This is for Ms. Bello, Dr. Bello.
Yes.
Can you give me the economic background of why is there a 20-year compulsory patent license? And why 20 years?
There isn't any particular reason why negotiators agreed on 20 years. In the United States, the system was 17 years from the grant of a patent. The United States accommodated the preferences of the European Union in the Uruguay round of trade negotiations and switched to a system that's based on 20 years from filing. The number of years isn't in the Constitution, but it is important to remember that the patent system is established in the Constitution itself because the constitutional forefathers appreciated that preventing free riding on somebody else's ideas and discoveries for some reasonable period of time would promote private innovation which benefits consumers, which in medicines is clearly the case.
Certainly.
And just one other thing, just so that you understand, the effective patent life of most medicines today is more like 11.2 years, according to the researchers at Tufts University. The reason there's such a discrepancy between 11 to 12 and 20, no one gets 20 years because that dates back to when a patent is filed, and on average for other products takes about 1.5 years for the patent office to review the patent application. For medicines, it takes longer, and of course, no medicine can be sold in this country until it's approved as safe and effective by the Food and Drug Administration.
Well, with all due respect, I would say that, with respect to the Constitution, I think as much as intellectual property was extremely important to our forefathers, I think that health and a crisis like this would be as important. Also, my question was really, what kind of return would economic return would the pharmaceutical industry actually need? How many years of patent license would they actually need to make up that return?
Let me stress that intellectual property protection promotes health care. We have 64 medicines to treat HIV/AIDS now. The government discovered 5 or 6 and developed them in partnership with industry. Some academic scientists, such at Yale, which is actually where I'll be teaching in the fall, trade law, and maybe Princeton in the spring. Some academic researchers have discovered other medications, but they've been developed by the pharmaceutical industry. And the protease inhibitors, in fact, much of the basic research was done by the pharmaceutical industry. I feel very passionately to appreciate that IP protection promotes health care because my only brother died of AIDS 10 years ago. My sister and I celebrated the 10th anniversary, celebrated his life in marking the 10th anniversary of his death earlier this month. He died because the industry had not yet discovered the protease inhibitors, which, when taken in combination treatments, are so effective. So IP plays an important role in promoting the discovery of these medicines, which are so important. And I don't know the answer to how much is the right number of patent life. I also don't know anything about any individual company's costs in researching and developing these drugs. That's a private commercial matter for each company. I know some averages.
I'm going to break with protocol and answer something of what you said and then turn it over to Jeff, who wants a rejoinder to this. The 20-year term of patent protection on pharmaceuticals is an international law requirement of the TRIPS agreement. So it was not present as a matter of international law until 1996 when it came into force. It was negotiated over, approximately a 10-year period before that in the Uruguay round. And that requirement, new as it is to all WTO members, although with it being phased in at different times for the least developed countries, that requirement is new to many of them. And in the past, many did one of two things. They either excluded patent protection for pharmaceuticals altogether, or if they allowed it for the process of manufacturing a pharmaceutical rather than the product, which meant that somebody manufacturing the same product but mixing the chemicals in the test tubes in a different way, if I can be flip about it, would be able to do so without infringing the patent. The extension of pharmaceutical patent protection to all WTO member countries was a major triumph for the industry. It was one that it worked very, very hard to achieve. And it's a trite observation, I think, to say that it's generated something of a backlash now. But it is a recent phenomenon, and I wanted to leave that impression with you. With that, over to Jeff.
I think the thing to keep in mind is that we should probably, if we can, well, we need to try to aim for two goals. One is to get medicines accessible to the poor, and particularly the poor in the poor countries. And second, to protect intellectual property rights incentives. I don't think that it is impossible to do that through radical tiering of the prices and segmenting the market so that the prices are low in the poor countries and high and patent protected in the rich countries. I don't agree that the companies have no responsibility in this, and this is just left to the private marketplace, because I'd rather take down the whole patent system if we can't get an effective tiering to allow both of these goals to be met. But we can, and that's where the companies are moving right now under a lot of pressure. They will lose no money under this because they're not selling to Africa. So as long as they're producing at cost, they lose nothing. It's a pure win-win situation. They get the activists off their backs, and they get to preserve their legitimacy, which is under tremendous threat right now, and the poor people get the drugs, and that's a good deal. So I think we should be working pragmatically to keep intellectual property rights alive in the high-income setting, but make sure that that doesn't interfere, as it has been interfering, with access in the poor countries. But then remember the basic problem, which is that even if the drugs are at cost, the poor countries can't afford to use them without additional international finance of several $billion a year. So we need both the tiering of the prices and money to make it possible for the poorest countries to use these drugs. Or even a country like South Africa, which has such a high adult prevalence rate that even though it's at a much higher income level, it can't afford to use the drugs even at $500 per capita. And what President Mbeki has to tell us is, yes, I urgently want to use the drugs, but I can't afford it, so help me. Those are the words we need to hear from President Mbeki.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Francoforte. In the Harvard consensus statement, you suggest peer review to ensure epidemiological high standards. But as you know, there's always a great disconnect between the policies that one suggests and then how they're implemented on the ground. How would you suggest providing access to the poorest, least infrastructurally capable countries in Africa to ensure that issues of drug resistance and that those concerns are addressed?
I think the key, which your question rightly stresses, is that these currently are not easy drugs to use, either for the patients or from a population scale. They are possible to use, and we've got to try, and we've got to start scaling up and learning how effective they are, but they're not easy to use. So it's not a matter of putting them in dispensaries for self-prescription, as you might with anti-malaria, or as done in Africa with some heavy cost actually, but as is done in Africa with anti-malarials. Here you need a very high rate of adherence to the drug regimens for this to work. So of course, technically, we proposed a directly observed therapy scheme as a backbone of the trials to see whether this can work. We also proposed a pretty rigorous standard for releasing the funding for this, that funding be for projects that are monitorable, that are where the projects themselves are observed and where they are evaluated. Because we don't want to blow up the drugs within 2 or 3 years as a result of very poor usage and then lose all hope of actually doing this. We want to do this properly, urgently, but systematically, carefully, and monitored. And I think that one of the keys is to get NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and the Centers for Disease Control very, very actively involved in the scaling up of this process.
Jeff, would you say some words about directly observed therapy?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Just the term that we use in the Harvard statement is DOT-HART, directly observed therapy for highly active antiretroviral therapy. And the idea is that DOT means that somebody, a community health worker or a doctor or a nurse, watches the patient take the medicine. That's how the main tuberculosis regimen is done in all parts of the world. And we even suggest using the backbone of the TB DOTs, so-called, to administer the DOT-HART. The problem is in tuberculosis it's called DOTs because directly observed therapy is followed by short course. It takes just 6 months if you're taking the tuberculosis medicines to rid yourself of the infection, whereas there is no short course for the current medicines in antiretroviral therapy. It is DOT-L rather than DOT-S. It's long-term, and it's got to be monitored, understanding that a patient's going into this for the long haul.
Yep. David?
Let me give a very specific, does this work? Let me give a very specific example. In Malawi, there is a tuberculosis program that's very respected. It's heavily funded by the British government, and it is a direct observed therapy program as described by Dr. Sachs. It turns out that the TB patients in this program are 70% co-infected with HIV. And they've already agreed that they would become the vanguard of ensuring that a large segment of the population of Malawi gets antiretrovirals in the context of the TB program, and that it could become the center and the backbone that could spread out to other sectors of society. Having said that, I want to mention something that was said earlier. Sometimes when we speak, and I do this all the time, I don't realize that people are not hearing exactly what I meant. I think we should treat everybody in the world. There is no question that treating babies and the sick give an example. I went with Stuart Landers to India, a friend of mine who's openly HIV positive and who works for a company called JSI. When he went to India, I thought I would be the big shot and do all the talking. It turns out the fact that he was HIV positive and healthy and taking drugs, everyone went and touched him. He went on TV. Doctors visited him. No one believed that there really were real medicines that could do something. If you have a country like Malawi whose sick people get out of bed in the Lazarus effect, you'll watch how rapidly the credibility of the possibility of using these drugs will sweep across the country, and the demand and the political will to go further will emerge. So I don't want to imply in any way that it's a bad idea to do this. What I'm trying to say is I think we need to take the opportunity to gear up big enough so that when that demand occurs, that we'll be in a position to have a broad enough treatment program to impact the epidemic itself, which I think we can do. In other words, I think we can get more out of this, ironically, than, quote, just. Obviously, saving life is number one. But I think we can do even more. We can save future lives if we design these programs in an effective way. We can go even further than we've been able to do in the United States, precisely because the programs can be structured and planned and run by governments and programs in a way that we, in our freewheeling society, don't do.
I want to first thank all of the panelists for speaking, but I do have a question for Dr. Sachs. And your comments kind of reminded me of something that I think has, at least in the past week that we've been doing this exercise, has kind of been avoided, and that's the issue of paternalism and American paternalism. And I don't think that you intended to do it, but your statements, I found some of them to be very offensive to the extent of that these poor African countries can't do anything on their own. And I'm just curious to know from your perspective, how is it that we as Americans, potentially about to become policymakers one day, how do we go on that fine line between trying to help and not become patronizing in the sense of saying that, well, you can't accomplish or be successful in this unless we come in and help you out?
Look, I was just in a room with 25 heads of state who were begging for help. Mm-hmm. So I'm not being paternalistic. I'm telling you what I just heard days ago. They're saying we can't afford it. We don't have the resources. Not that there are not lots of very bright and brilliant people that would love to do things, but they're impoverished. That's all I'm saying. I wasn't making a moral statement in the way you're implying, or a value judgment statement in the way you're implying. Quite the opposite. They're dying because they're too poor to gain access to the treatments. That's all I'm saying. And the African leadership has been coming to me for years saying, can't we do something? Mm-hmm. That's it. So it's money. It's money. That's not paternalism. That's money. Money's a real thing in this world. Mm-hmm. And the biggest problem with being poor is you don't have enough money.
I'll talk to you.
Yeah, sure. But thanks for hearing it so I could make that clear.
I want to talk about the drug piece.
What you said was they can't do anything alone. And of course, there are things they can do. They desperately need
Hi, my question is for Ms. Bello. Last week, a physician from Kenya told us about a drug that treated a particular fatal disease. He said that the company that invented it wouldn't market it because of the small market, and after turning the patent over to the World Health Organization, no company came forward to develop it either. You mentioned the comparative advantage of innovation, but how would you suggest encouraging pharma companies to devote R&D efforts to Africa-specific diseases, which often have low monetary returns for the companies, or developing drugs that have small markets? And how do pharma companies weigh those ethical considerations and obligations?
That's a really, really good question. I do disagree, Jeff, that patents have been a big barrier so far in the developing world because so many countries have not applied patent protection for pharmaceuticals to date and have not been obligated to do so yet under the TRIPS rules. So to date, patents have played a very small role. And as you see from millions of people dying from diarrhea, malaria, and TB, patents haven't been the big issue. The bigger issue is how do we create incentives to have more discovery and development of treatments that will help people in the tropical zone, whereas the pharmaceutical industry devotes relatively more resources to R&D of drugs that affect Americans, Europeans, Japanese. I would suggest, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't figure out how to do that better here in the US, but reacting to the comment about paternalism, I think we ought to figure out incentives that can help develop an industry in countries in the tropical zones so that you can have not only self-help, but you can have, say, an Indian research-based pharmaceutical industry that could mirror the success of the Indian industries on software and computer protection. India took different policies on these two issues. For computers and software, they decided to provide intellectual property protection, and they're very competitive in these areas. But on pharmaceuticals, they decided not to, and so they have a very strong generic industry that copies medicines, but there's less investment in this area in India because of their anti-IP policies, and there's no Indian industry that is trying to focus on developing better treatments for malaria, tuberculosis, and other diseases that affect the developing world. So I think the reason that you don't see more of an R&D-based industry in some of these better developed developing countries like Brazil, like India, is because to date they have not provided an incentive to do so by preventing free riding on other people's discovery of medicines which can further help. In the United States, we could think about something along the lines of the Orphan Drug Act. An orphan drug is a drug that treats a disease for which there are fewer than 200,000 patients. Those 200,000 patients mean a lot to themselves and their families, their friends, their communities, but there's too few of them for there to be a market incentive until the Congress in 1983 passed the Orphan Drug Act. There was only 10 orphan drugs before 1983, and with the increased incentive to invest in developing a drug to treat orphan diseases, we now have over 200. So if the Congress makes this a priority and provides an incentive to encourage development of drugs to treat tropical diseases, it can work as the Orphan Drug Act has shown.
I have a slightly different, I think that there's a different picture we need to be looking at. Number one, the three major killers of the world, HIV, TB, and malaria, have good drugs. And I think the startling phenomena is the political will does not exist on this planet to deal with these three killers. I think that's the thing that's so startling. With respect to the IPO issues, I really think that's a sideshow and much more complicated than it's been presented so far. With all due respect to Judy, we really don't have a good, clear analysis of the exact role of those incentives in the creation of new products. So let me give you an example. In the half century from the Second World War to the end of the 19th century, virtually all of the drugs that were created were in large or small part directly due to large-scale investments on the part of the federal government of the United States in the NIH funding cycle. Almost all the drugs we talk about were invented at taxpayers' expense at universities by professors, later got bought up by companies that took the Model T and built factories, manufactured it, put it through, in some instances, clinical trials. Let's go down the A drugs. AZT65, invented at NCI, actually, by 5 individuals. Burroughs really was considered an impediment to the development of that drug. D4T, Yale University, 3TC, University of Minnesota, DDI, patent still held by the United States government. The first protease inhibitor was developed at NIH. It was given to Abbott to further develop with a grant from NIH. There's been a relationship between, that's almost impossible to disentangle, between the federal government programs, the NIH programs, the university community, and the drug companies that defies any real description. There's no bad guy or good guy in this. I'm not trying to say that. I'm really saying that there's a collaboration whose complexity is almost impossible to analyze for a variety of reasons, including the necessary secrecy around some aspects of private sector behavior. So how you go about, I don't think that intellectual property rights is sort of a solution to the problem of how you get new drugs, how you get new anything else. And I think that's a debate that should happen in a different context, because right now we've got this emergency going on. What we need to do is find out how to get existing drugs available to the planet. I think that if we want to have another public policy debate about the issue of how to most effectively do research and science and move the frontier of knowledge forward in the area of pharmaceuticals, I think it's a different issue. And certainly I would have a lot to say about that, as would other people. But I think that's not really what's at stake here. I don't think that's where we're at.
Jeff, can we have a brief answer?
Yeah, I wanted to just come back one more time quickly to this issue about what countries can do, just to clarify. The U.S., for its own AIDS crisis, is spending $10 billion per year right now. We are spending about $5 billion roughly on treatment and a couple billion on research and $1 billion roughly on education, a couple billion on financial support for AIDS-impacted individuals and so forth. All the components, we spend an incredible amount of money. All I wanted to say was there's a big difference between $10,000 per person per year or $10 billion total and what you can get for $3 or $4. I wasn't per year. I wasn't meaning to disparage anybody. I was meaning to make plain how completely trapped the poor countries are right now. So I please don't want to be misunderstood as having made a disparaging, left a disparaging sense about that. I was talking about the tragedy of impoverishment only. In terms of the IPRs, we spent several years wasting our time beating down the drug companies' prices to production costs. We're there now, but don't say it was time well spent. This was a waste of time that we had this international property rights regime, which made it hard to see the way quickly down to drugs at cost for the poor countries. And we're there now. It's no longer the big issue. The big issue is the money issue now. But that's because after 3 or 4 years of wasting our time on this, we finally have beaten down the prices down to where they needed to be in the poor country markets. And we hope that the slow response of the industry to doing that doesn't boomerang and undermine the industry so fatally that we also lose the IPRs in the rich country markets. I'm worried about the backlash at this point, but I think the industry, unfortunately, only has itself to blame in part for that risk of backlash right now, because it took a long time to get where we are. We're at a place now where we need to be, and that's progress at least.
Great. This is directed to Professor Sachs. Given the current administration's budgetary commitments, tax cuts, and also prescription benefits, I think no one doubts the moral imperative of the need to act, but given this administration's priorities, how on earth do you convince them of the need to do this?
Good question. If you read the Wall Street Journal, page 3 today, it says the U.S. is about to sign on to a global health fund. They haven't announced how much money. And I think that progress has been made. I think the best answer to it is that humanitarian will is part of it, but U.S. national interest is a very strong part as well. It really isn't the case that this country can sit and watch the greatest pandemic run unchecked without serious diminishing of U.S. national interests and strategic considerations being raised. We already have a continent massively destabilized already, and it's going to get worse. And state failure, which is the logical and empirical concomitant of this kind of disease pandemic and economic collapse, leads very frequently to military intervention or to loss of other strategic assets. And so I think that it's not a coincidence that the CIA actually came first and the National Intelligence Council came first and were the first groups in the U.S. government to identify strategic interests. And later, the line ministries are involved. What is bizarre, and I think it's one of the failures of international architecture, is that this gets discussed at the IMF. And so we have the Treasury quickly learning about AIDS. It's kind of silly. It's a waste of time, actually, in a world of division of labor. This should be done at State Department and Health and Human Services, not the Treasury. But in any event, slowly, the American national interest is coming through. And I think in the end, among the hard-headed realists of this administration, that's where a lot of the weight is going to be carried. There is a humanitarian focus, but there's also a U.S. strategic interest. We get a lot of oil. We get a lot of military risk. There are a lot of public health risks of a continent facing fulminant disease, which spreads all over the world. And I think that that's why we're seeing some response right now.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question related to that?
Very, very short.
Given what you've said about the difficulties with creating behavior change, how do you convince people that treatment, with all of its difficult protocols, is something that can be followed?
Oh, people are going to come begging for treatment. The first rule of life is people like to stay alive. And they don't have any option right now to stay alive. But once they see people out of the deathbed, back at work, which you see with these drugs in a very short period of time, there's going to be an incredible social mobilization, just as David said.
Okay, Michael, please.
I just want to comment on the issue of behavior change. But I want to do so in the context of an understanding that, and I hope it has been coming across fairly well through the panel, that this is a very complex issue, number one, but there really is no one position which answers all the questions or answers all the problems. And so I think it really is inappropriate and difficult to be dogmatic about any one of the positions that have been put forward. But I think the fact of the matter is that behavior change does require the incentive of potentially available treatments. But if that treatment is known about and it is not available, as is the case in most African countries, it seriously undermines behavioral efforts. And there's lots of evidence of it in South Africa already, of the debate that has happened in the past 18 months, sparked initially by President Mbeki's own intellectual brainstorm. But then subsequently by the court action and the fact that these drugs and the availability of these drugs is now known by everybody in South Africa, but they're not available. But young people are saying, where's the threat? What's the risk to me? The bottom line here is quite simple. Most African populations are youthful. In most countries, as in South Africa, about 40% of the population is adolescent. It's under 15. In South Africa alone, at the current rate of infection, 50% of that 12 million will become HIV positive. And that is, even if there is treatment, they will become HIV positive. Okay, maybe they go on treatment, maybe they don't. And with the notion that a treatment might be accessible, the opportunity to prevent infection among those young kids in the first place becomes so much more difficult. So I'm not for a moment arguing that treatment shouldn't be made available and shouldn't be dramatically increased, but we have to recognize the fundamental importance of prevention in the context of a comprehensive approach to HIV. And I also argue very strongly that we can't simply look at prevention in the context of a condom or sexual behavior alone. Clearly it is about sexual behavior, but sexual behavior happens in a broader context as well. I want to make one last statement about the issue of money. Of course it's all about money, but money is also the source of resentment. And as sure as hell as the governments are asking the developed world for the money out of one side of the mouth, they're going to be resenting receiving that money out of the other sides of their mouth. So the difficulty that we're creating in international politics shouldn't be underestimated either.
Adam, I'd like you to hold for a moment. I want to exercise moderator's privilege and put two questions into this debate that's going on right now. One to Michael: what is the evidence from epidemiological studies that prevention has been, or education has been effective in altering behavior in a preventative way? There is one reading that you have from The Lancet, which does look at a case control study of prevention in East Africa. And also to Jeff, in the call for heightened resources from the rich nations, what sort of quid pro quo must there be from the developing countries, either to augment their own resources towards the problem or perhaps on an organizational level? You first.
The evidence for behavior change, I think, is most strongly put forward in cases of the case of Thailand and Uganda. First, let me say, though, that behavior change is inordinately difficult. There is no magic bullet. There's no, if you do A, B, C, D, you're going to affect this type of change. What is clear from the Thai and Ugandan cases is that a focused intervention which galvanizes national attention. In other words, there has to be what we call the loud voice. In the case of Uganda, it was the president, and all arms of government were mobilized to, in the first instance, inform the public of the risk of HIV, and in the second instance, to help them understand that HIV was a function of sexual behavior. And that in itself was enormously revolutionary. Sex, for a politician to talk publicly about sex in most African countries, is inordinately difficult. Overcoming the cultural issues that Professor Sachs referred to are extremely difficult, and it requires leaders of real stature to be able to break down those taboos. And that's essentially what happened in Uganda. And I think the case study you have is the low beer Stoneburner case study, maybe, of Uganda, where they track epidemiologically how the rates of infection began to decline once it was internalized in community-based communication networks, that this was essentially a risk related to sexual behavior. And the declines were mostly related to partner reduction and abstinence, delayed sexuality among teenagers. In the case of the Thais, it was a very targeted intervention, targeting, in the first instance, sex workers and their customers. But there again, there was a high-profile government champion. African countries are different. I think it's also very easy for us to paint all of those countries with the same brush. South Africa is substantially different from Uganda. For example, in South Africa, television viewership among 15 to 20-year-olds has gone from 45% 5 years ago to 75% today. 75% of 15-year-olds in South Africa are watching the same soapies that you watch 7 days a week. So, you know, these are issues that we need to also recognize. And so they have the same goals, they have the same aspirations, and yet when you tailor behavior messages that say, don't, this is not for you, you're set up to fail, as I think Professor Sachs suggested. So the notion of creating opportunities which include treatment, but also include a life, that you can live that life to your fullest prospect, then behavior has a chance.
Okay.
I think there's coming soon a very important set of operational questions. If you get the money, what do you actually do with it, and what do you require of all parties to this? And my basic philosophy on this and set of assumptions is that countries themselves should work out national programs, and that those programs should be submitted for funding to a global health fund, so that the programs are generated from the ground up, and then they are submitted for vetting by an international fund which would release the funds and which would have fiduciary responsibility for a very large scale, indeed unprecedented global effort. So there are responsibilities on both sides. On the country side, I think the responsibility is that the government, first of all, must work with civil society for this to have any chance of working. So you don't want a program that runs just through a health ministry, but that incorporates the NGOs, incorporates the medical schools and schools of public health when they exist, incorporates local government, and demonstrates in a good faith way that this is a social mobilization on a broad scale, not a national Ministry of Health top-down program, which is sure to fail in this context because it has to reach into communities. Second, I think the plans have to be monitorable, they have to be auditable, they have to be transparent in operation, they have to be subject to ex post evaluation, they have to bring forward local expertise for work together with global expertise in terms of design, implementation, and ex post evaluation. In other words, the quid pro quo, in my view, is the rich countries should put in billions of dollars per year, but the recipient countries should take responsibility that that money is properly used, and that this is really a partnership in that sense, with both sides having very high standards. One is adequate financing, and the other is exceptionally high standards of the effectiveness of the use.
Michael would like a 30-second rejoinder.
The 30-second, not necessarily rejoinder, but add-on is the danger in the international fund, and I'm sure Professor Sachs is aware of this, is in the politics of it. Let's take a country like South Africa, for example. We essentially have a non-compliant government. Do we condemn the 40 million people of South Africa not to have any access to that fund? It has taken the Kaiser Family Foundation, a private institution, to create a truly national program in South Africa. And that's, I think, an issue that we really are going to have to contend with.
Yes, Amir, thank you.
Yes.
Let me just share a reflection after 20 years of facing that problem in my own in my own work. First of all, South Africa's hang-ups are almost unique in the world. This has to be understood. This is not the hang-ups of Malawi, of Botswana, of Tanzania, of Nigeria. South Africa is a case in itself right now. We don't have any other leadership with this kind of allergy to international help that South Africa has, and I want that understood, because if we're the whole continent with that allergy, it would be quite different. But everyone is begging for help, and South Africa is standing aloof. My own guess is that it is absolutely impossible to do around a hostile government. And therefore, it's also impossible to do if the private sector and civil society are not actively involved as well. So government by itself can't do it, but there's no way an international fund can operate around government. So I hope that Mr. Mbeki's government would get its head around the problem for the first time.
Adam.
Thank you. I think that it's fairly apparent to see the moral outrage that's involved in this situation. I hope that all of us feel a sense of public policy outrage. And I'm alarmed for two reasons, or I have kind of two questions I want to address. One is related to what Professor Sachs has addressed quite convincingly about the desperate need for financing and for additional resources. But my fear is that in being pragmatic and bending over backward to be cost effective, we still make a lot of assumptions about what is possible, what are our targets. And you look at the costing studies that many of you have been studying, they assume oftentimes no additional investments in infrastructure in these countries and no huge amounts of community support and infrastructural development. So that's one concern, that we're still significantly falling short, and we don't portray as if we're addressing the biggest pandemic in our generation, and we actually don't meet that demand. My second concern is about the pharmaceutical industry has certainly made strides in terms of cutting the prices. Some pharmaceutical companies have dropped their patents as of late. I want to hear from you, Judy Bello, about what efforts are being made internally within the industry to continue to invest in research to simplify the regimens of these drugs and to continue to cut the costs, whether that's through bulk production and using the economies of scale to increasingly reduce the cost. Because if we take a tiered pricing model, certainly the lower the price that we can sell it to African countries, the more people that can be treated.
Judy, I'm going to add something on to Adam's question. Could you speak about the possibility of the patent holders voluntarily licensing production to generic manufacturers to supply developing country needs?
Yeah, more than one of us wants to get in on this. Let me start with your second question. First of all, the industry deeply appreciates that simplified regimens are vital for American HIV/AIDS patients as well as HIV/AIDS patients in other parts of the world. So there is a very significant amount of research that is being done to try to simplify what currently is a very difficult regimen. With what prospects of success is always speculative. The major problem in the pharmaceutical industry is that statistically, historically, most drugs fail in development. 80% of most of the drugs that go through clinical trials fail. And then, of course, of those that are successful therapeutically, Duke economists have found that on average, only 3 of 10 generate revenues that meet or exceed average R&D expenses. But the industry is focusing on trying to find vaccines, new treatments, and including more simplified treatments. What's being done to encourage individual companies to decide to be willing to relinquish their patent rights or to agree to cross-license? And again, that's patents, like prices, are commercial matters. So this is not something that it can be discussed at pharma. It is clear that companies, with some prodding, to be sure, and lots of pressure, many of them have voluntarily reduced their prices. At least one of them has relinquished patent rights for its HIV/AIDS drugs. and we'll see what happens with others. The main impediment to date, in the eyes of many, were prices, because as I've stressed, patents have largely not been an issue in many of these developing countries, at least so far. And if that situation changes as the TRIPS rules become more effective, I'm quite confident that we'll have lots of friends urging individual companies to do with their patent rights what they've done with their prices.
Just a bit of science here, which is what I spend most of my time doing. We already have a whole set of newly very highly simplified regimens that look very effective. The most recent one to actually be approved was Trizavir, 1 pill twice a day. We have a whole set of second-generation NNRTIs, they're called, with very long half-lives. That means they can be taken probably once a day, maybe even once every 2 days. There's a once-a-day protease that is in clinical trial at this point that looks quite excellent. Reductions in toxicities with new sets of regimens look very promising. There are sets of fusion inhibitors that look like they're going to be incredible, especially because they're synergistic with each other. I would assume that the pipeline is huge, has many elements in it, and we will see continued simplifications of these drugs over time. One of the reasons for this is kind of obvious. Right now, you have a market, right? The best way to get a bigger market share right now is to get a better drug out there. It's a big market, there's a lot of money in it, and you can just count on, I can't tell you when you go to the meetings, the number of different efforts being made is mind-boggling. We're talking about 5,000 or 6,000 separate efforts going on at any given time to simplify or change regimens and developments. We're going to get great drugs. I'm not really worried about that.
We have over 100 in development currently.
Okay. Over here, please.
Yes, this is for Mr. Sinclair. I'm wondering what the role or the position of NGOs is in this process, and how does that differ from what governments can do?
I think the role of NGOs is absolutely crucial because in all of the countries that we're talking about, South Africa included, the government's capacity to get down to a community level is very limited. However, there is a strong resistance on the part of most governments to acceding that kind of responsibility on a national level to NGOs. In some ways, I think that's the breakthrough that we've been able to make in South Africa, is to launch a truly national program and to drive a truly national program outside of government. And the government is, in fact, now putting very substantial money into it itself, but it's entirely driven outside of government and by NGOs. I think they're vital. I want to make one other point there, though, that there is another opportunity to develop the indigenous NGO infrastructure, and a real danger that international NGOs, as has tended to be the custom, will be the recipients of most of this money with very little capacity development left in the countries where it's most needed.
Hi, my name is Morris, and I just want to ask a question, particularly for Judith, but also for the rest of the panel. What's your perspective on ethics of pricing for drugs? I mean, it seems to me that up until now you're taking a very legal realism perspective that what the market will bear is what we will charge. But in the case of life-threatening, or for illnesses that are life-threatening, shouldn't there be another standard in place? And I would kind of pitch an alternative proposal. Couldn't we just charge really high prices for a lot of frivolous drugs like Viagra and Rogaine, and then use those monies to subsidize the cost of production of drugs, hard drugs?
First, and again, because I'm an anal lawyer, I have to just remind everybody, at the Trade Association, we don't discuss prices. We can't be involved in pricing policies under the antitrust laws. There are really interesting ethical questions many and numerous, that affect every aspect of drug discovery, development, testing, marketing, et cetera. Look at what capital does, though, I urge you. And that is, ask all these ethical questions and advocate what you think the right answer should be. But basically, money flows to where the opportunity for return is commensurate with risk. The risk in pharmaceutical research is very high because the majority of drugs fail at some point in the development process. Of the drugs that are approved as safe and effective, and they're miracles for the families who are able to have a better and longer life because of them. Nonetheless, most of those drugs really don't pay for themselves, much less cross-subsidize the continuing drug discovery and development process. So if you artificially, through governmental action, international, federal, local, whatever, if you restrict the opportunity for a return on a certain class of medicines, assume for this purpose HIV/AIDS medicines, what you are doing is you are driving private investment to other disease groups where there is an opportunity, no guarantee, but at least an opportunity to earn a return that is commensurate with risk. And so, for example, my terrible concern about erosion of intellectual property protection for HIV/AIDS in particular is that if you treat HIV/AIDS differently in the United States or other countries, significantly differently than you do other diseases, and after all, let's remember that heart disease, cancer, and stroke are the 3 leading killers of Americans, which more Americans are more directly and personally interested in than HIV/AIDS, you are discouraging private research efforts. I readily agree that there's a very complex synergy between government, academic, and private scientists, but in the 1990s, it was industry that developed 370 new medicines, compared to 239 in the 80s. Now, if industry went away because it was no longer a profitable use of capital, to some degree we would certainly hope that private endowments, charities, and governments would step up. But you'd be taking a huge leap of faith as to how much government and academia would do to compensate for what private industry does today. So, if you differentially treat different disease groups, or you differentiate between life-threatening or other diseases, you are actually creating disincentives for innovation for life-threatening diseases. Now, I think maybe your question then is, but shouldn't an individual company take into account the importance and significance of its medicine and the need for it when it decides on its pricing policy?
One drug?
And I can't honestly answer that question because I don't know how a single medicine is in fact priced. It's a mystery to me because the antitrust laws preclude my participation in it, and I've never worked for an individual company. It's just not what I know.
Can I just ask a follow-up, just to survey? I'd like to survey the panel because it seems to me, obviously, your perspective. Just lost my train of thought. Without this private capital, that these drug companies would have any incentive to engage in this research, and none of these drugs would be developed. But I think realistically, the NIH, the universities, they're doing a huge amount of the research that's involved in this. And so to really use that argument to say, oh, like us poor industries, we need this monetary incentive, when it's really the government that's doing a great deal of this research. I'm just wondering what the other panelists thought about that.
I think what you need to differentiate between, for the purposes of your question, are those drugs for which there is a natural market, the drugs that perhaps relate to heart disease, cancer, and so forth, where there's a natural, affluent, high-paying market, and those for which there is not. And that includes things like malaria, very clearly. And then there are diseases such as AIDS, which straddle the line, that have a market in the rich countries and a certain number of potential consumers in the poor countries, but not ones who can, given their limited financial resources, participate in a market on their own. With that distinction, I'm going to turn it over to the panel.
Look, I think don't ask a cat to act differently than a cat does. We set up certain institutions in society to act in certain ways. We have private companies. They act a certain way. You have to expect that they will continue to act that way. So I think the issue is not to sort of demonize one institution or another, but to reflect upon how can we best use the institutions we have, each of which have very, very serious shortcomings, to our benefit. The Soviet Union in 74 years produced exactly one drug that's worth anything to anybody. So it's not at all clear that having state-run facilities necessarily results in anything. On the other hand, a freewheeling India is producing more drugs per day than you can possibly imagine. Nothing new. What it does do, interestingly enough, is develop better ways to make old drugs really quickly and efficiently, which the FDA here doesn't allow. Anyway, I think what I'm trying to say is I think this requires another discussion in another context because with regard to AIDS in Africa around the world, we have the drugs. How do we get them to people? How do we use them is the issue. I think that the debate around intellectual property rights and how you get new drugs is a very complicated one. I don't think that it's been on the table. Let me give you an example. We don't know, we actually don't know, no one does, exactly how much research, primary research is done by drug companies compared to the federal government. We don't know that. We guess at it. We get reports on it, but we really don't know the answer to that. We say that a drug is produced by a drug company. It turns out when you research it very carefully, it was 3 guys at the NIH who went out and formed a drug company like Trimeris that got bought up by another like Roche. You see, how do you evaluate the extent to which that wouldn't have happened had the 3 people not had the opportunity to go out and start that company? I don't know. I guess I'm trying to say I think that would require an entire debate and discussion, and we should have that debate and discussion. I'm anything but a supporter of freewheeling, free enterprise, around drug development. I think there's another model, but I'm not sure this is the context. I just not sure this is the context. If the drug companies tomorrow morning did everything they could around AIDS, they would have done no more than what they've done now. I think the one thing you can pin them on is, why the hell didn't they get up 3-4 years ago when Emilio Mini said, we have the answer from Merck, and at that point in time have enough common sense to see that there'd be a world reaction. In other words, they should have a long time ago said that they would give drugs at cost to poor countries to stave off this epidemic. And ironically, had they done that, most of us who are activists would have focused our attention on the federal government to get up the money to buy them. Okay. Instead of, you know.
Let's hold there. Oh, Jeff, quickly.
If you were just concerned about the U.S. and put aside the problems of poor countries, I think you'd probably come to the conclusion the system's working quite well. Very dynamic, huge private sector investment in R&D, major innovation, as compared to other rich country markets where price control and other government interventions actually have stifled R&D and have forced the firms to move to the U.S. market, as a matter of fact. So if the only issue were the rich countries, I think you'd say this is a pretty good system. We got NIH pumping out a lot of science, and we have the pharmaceuticals pumping out a lot of development, and the process is producing a lot of drugs for a lot of Americans. And when Americans are not wealthy enough to buy the drugs because they're at the low end of the income distribution, we ought to have public funding to help them, as we do with the AIDS drugs, for example. And we should allow basically this system. The problem comes in that you have the poor countries in addition. So I wouldn't break the core here, but I would then find, whether it's through tiered pricing or other mechanisms, to make sure that we get the drugs to the poor countries. The question to ask, which is the next step, is if you tier the prices, as I believe we should do, are we going to undermine the total scope of R&D and antiretrovirals so far actually as to hurt inadvertently the poor? Should we get public money to actually pay for a lot more antiretroviral research? The problem becomes harder with malaria and other diseases where you don't have a core market in the rich countries. And then we find that there's almost no research going on vis-a-vis the poor countries, and that raises a different set of issues. But undermining the property rights in that context will worsen things dramatically. We have to find incentives, including property rights, to get the major pharma industry interested in problems of malaria more than they are right now.
Yeah. Thank you all for speaking to us today. I wanted to go back to the treatment versus prevention issue for a second, if I could, and point out that the relationship between treatment and prevention is not always positive, at least from what we've seen in the US. 2 points that come to mind. One is that access to effective treatment can cause people to take the disease less seriously and therefore engage in higher risk behavior than they might otherwise. And 2 is that if treatment keeps people alive longer, but they continue to engage in high risk behavior, they might actually transmit the disease to a lot more people than they otherwise would. And so I just wonder if you could talk about strategies for addressing that problem in a way that treatment can contribute to prevention efforts rather than sabotage them.
Could I talk on that for a moment? Because I have I've done a lot. I've looked at a lot of the research around that. That's a concern that's theoretical. What you find, generally speaking, just think of this for a second. Before we had effective antiretroviral therapy, people didn't want to go get tested. You know why? They didn't want to know. They didn't want to know because knowing just makes you feel like shit and scares everybody else, et cetera. It was when the antiretroviral therapies became available that there was a point to getting tested in the first place. Now, here's another little odd thing. When you're tested and you find out you're positive, your behavior by and large changes. Most people don't want to infect someone else. And when they know they're positive, they behave in a different manner. So what I'm suggesting to you is that, ironically, testing itself, which is a crucial part of prevention, really, is dependent upon the existence of therapy. That effective therapy becomes an incentive to that testing, which in turn leads to behavioral modification, even on the simplest level. If you know you're positive, you act differently than other ones.
I want to take one more question from over here, and we'll see if we can do one more at the other microphone.
Okay, thank you. I have two linked questions, but the first is very short. The first is for Professor Jeff Sachs, since you've just come back from Nigeria. So, to what extent was there consensus among the leaders, among the heads of state, to speak with a loud voice, to use your words, about the need for prevention, and specifically to try to promote kind of the changes in the social and economic conditions that influence sexual behavior and gender inequality? And then the follow-up question is, assuming that there's differentiation.
Due to the short time, I'm going to actually stop you there.
The second question is better.
I'm sorry.
All right, we'll choose one answer. Why don't
I'm sorry. Let's go to Jeff for that.
All right. I think that there is a lot of interest in many parts of Africa and little interest in other parts of Africa. And South Africa's position I found very peculiar throughout the whole conference because it just didn't want to be pushed into any kind of position that was very clear. So I don't think we're going to get a uniformity given that we're talking about a continent with 49 countries and a lot of different qualities of leadership. But I would like those that are ready to move to be given the financial capacity to move with much more dynamism than they've been up until now.
Does that mean we can exert some kind of conditionality in allocating the funds in the war chest?
In my opinion, you have to allocate funds based on programs and their credibility, precisely. So that if programs are submitted that are not credible, that don't have government backing, that have excluded civil society, that don't talk about core issues, I think expert independent review will kick them back to the countries and say this is not really the kind of thing on which the world can stake billions of dollars in your country at this point. Unlike an admissions process, it's not the end of the story necessarily. You get another chance to come back in the next grant writing round. But I think there absolutely has to be seriousness on both sides. Let's not fake the real programs, and let's not fake the real support. Let's push both sides to a much higher standard than they're used to being at. Much more money, but backing much more real programs.
Okay. One last question from over here. One question.
I just have one. It's
With
a big one.
4 parts.
No, I wanted to follow up on the first half of Adam's question, which I don't think was addressed, or maybe it was more of a comment. But regarding political will, it seems to me that even here in the context of a spring exercise, I feel very constrained by so many assumptions that we make about what actually is possible, given the magnitude of the problem. And that in all of our organizations, government or otherwise, we're led towards pragmatism over thinking big in response to a huge problem. So I just wanted some general final comments on, given the scale of the crisis and the many ways that we could define the problem, what do you think the capacity is for generating and leveraging political will to challenge the assumptions that we make?
Generating political will in the countries affected, or in this country, do you mean? Jeffrey Sachs is probably better informed than I am since he's just come from Nigeria, but I think that the weight of international opinion is certainly facing in the right direction, let's put it that way. Whether that will result in an accumulation of the sort of resources that are being talked about in the media is another question, I think. I think the bigger question is, how do you sustain that political will? Because AIDS is not going to go away in 2 or 3 years' time. We're still going to be having this conversation in a decade from now. And how do you sustain it, I think is going to be a lot more challenging.
Any submissions from the middle here?
Well, I just want to stress that obviously political and public opinion are driven very significantly by the media. And one of the roles of NGOs is that they've been so skillful at getting the media to attend to these particular challenges. So I think you're trying to increase political will to do more here requires more of the process that we've been engaged in, and that is for people who care, individual citizens, groups, NGOs, other institutions, to talk about the issue, to have programs like this, but outside the academic community as well as inside it, and to deal with the media, which is very effective and has been very effective in getting this issue on public television.
As a former elected official, I'd just like to talk to you in a personal way for a minute. When a senator's office or a congressman gets 20 or 30 actual phone calls from your parents in particular, your uncles, your cousins, your friends, it has an unbelievable impact because it just doesn't happen as often as you think. Don't underestimate yourself, and don't underestimate the amount of power convincing one U.S. rep who happens to be sitting in the right committee has to change the number of decimal points in an allocation. We're talking about a relatively small amount of money. The good news is the amount of money we're talking about is actually relatively modest, which means that a relatively small number of people who are really intent upon that happening could influence the U.S. Congress in a significant manner. You have a lot of power, the people in this room, to make that budget go up a little bit next year. And I wouldn't underestimate it.
Jeff, 2 minutes from you, and then we'll do some closing announcements.
1 minute. I don't think we should choose a dollar amount or a target of number of people to be treated. What our standard should be is not to let the money be the limiting factor. There are many other limiting factors right now, capacity, infrastructure, reaching populations. We don't know yet how effective these medicines are going to be in local contexts, whether adherence will be high enough to permit their effective use. We have to treat this very carefully and very seriously, but our standard should be, if it's working, keep rolling it out, and don't say that an artificial limit of 1 billion and that's all, and we've run out of money, should be the norm. So I think what we tell the government in advocacy should not be a target. For instance, the Harvard consensus statement says, target at least 1 million by the 3rd year. That's not because that's a normative judgment that that is the right number. That's because that was a sense in the group, actually. Some thought it was too high, some too low, of what was feasible given the infrastructure, training, rollout. But what we said was target at least, because the clear view was don't let the money be the limiting factor. Let the real capacity to do this, taking seriously that this is not easy to do. This is going to be one of the toughest public health initiatives ever launched. This is not putting a vaccine in an arm. This is a major change of health delivery in a continent that has that is absolutely bereft of medical infrastructure right now. We need to do it, but we need to do it carefully and not let the dollars, which are small in the scheme of things, be the factor that's going to determine how much and how far.
Okay, I'd like to thank all of our panelists and all of you for your...
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. 1 billion, 1.2 billion is not just AIDS.
Just like to thank all of you for your attention and to say that there is a reception in Taubman A, B, and C. However, en route to A, B, and C, you will find a tantalizing array of food outside the Allison dining room, which is not yours. So don't eat it. And please go into Taubman and eat there. That's for somebody else. There's also an announcement, I understand, from a few students. If they could just please go to a microphone.
Sweeney, president of the AFL-CIO, has flown into Boston today. He said he's prepared to be arrested on the steps of Mass Hall in support of the Living Wage campaign. We're late, so if you want to come and join us, we're meeting just over here. We're going to race straight on up to the yard. So if you support Living Wage, we're moving up now.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah, they really are.
Hi, thank you.
Good.